is Chris Love, and I'm the Department Chair of English here at TASIS. And this is the second annual event in collaboration with the Hermann Hesse Museum. So it's a real pleasure to introduce this event and talk about what we're doing. What we've tried to do is say that we actually have this international community. And a lot of people outside the world of TASIS, I have found, don't know that we have as many languages represented as we do. We have a section of Italian for elementary school and a section of Italian for middle school and a full IB program in Italian as well. In addition to that, we have multiple languages that the students speak. I think we have something like 72 different nations right now represented at TASIS. So it's pretty incredible that we have this much cultural diversity, and we have not just a representative of that diversity here and the students that are representing their countries, but we have also three really curious, intellectually adventurous students who have a lot to say and think about not just their own countries and their literatures, but about world literature in general. I want to introduce Stella here, who's going to introduce herself and talk about some of her ideas about the program before we begin. But I want to give a round of applause to the students here. I will say the first is Alessia Primo, who is from Italy. And we have Anastasia Sozanovska. She sometimes goes by Nastia or Anna, and she'll choose which one tonight. And Diana Xiao, who is coming from China and is representing China here tonight. So thank you, Stella, for inviting us again, and I will just take a seat to the side.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all you here. It's very nice because last year we were here to speak about books, to speak about literature, and to guess to know how we can to create our worldwide library. Because of in 1929 Hermann Hesse wrote this book, Eine Bibliothek der Weltliteratur, and we wanted with Marcel Henry, the director of the Museo Hermann Hesse Montagnola, to create this series of events, Hesse Now, to discover together how we can create today our worldwide literature and library, because of, I think that is a need we have, because when Hermann Hesse wrote this text, he has a lot of tips for how to create our library, but today, almost a century after, how we can create this library in our houses, in our contests and so, and it's very beautiful to see that we have a lot of interesting books together today, because it's very important to know and to discover a lot of stories and histories that at the time of Hermann Hesse we didn't know. So I'm very happy to be here again this year and to discover these new stories that your students have here. So thank you.
Let's just say one thing.
Yes.
I want to say one thing about the framing of this event and how we thought of this. One thing that we discussed in this was this idea of world literature, universal literature, and the idea of literature that is part of your language and your culture, and how those feed into each other. And so the questions that we asked the students and that we asked ourselves really was, how do you see a work that you love fitting into the framework of world literature? And how do you see a work of literature that is tied to your language, tied to your culture? And how, for example, would you like to see that disseminated and expressed across the world? And those are not mutually exclusive by any means, but I do think it's an interesting and kind of compelling question to ask ourselves. We have these works of literature that are tied to our own language, and through translation, and through book markets, and through advertising, and through museums, and through all these kind of the cultural apparatus of the world, these somehow make their way across the world, and sometimes they don't, and that's always a shame. So I'm hoping that this will address some of these fundamental issues about world literature tonight. I will turn it back to you.
Okay, so when we met with Professor Krislov 1 month ago, maybe a little bit more, we spoke about this new event here at the Palmer Theatre, and we spoke about literature and also on freedom. So maybe we can start with our tavola rotonda is in Italian, I don't know. and we can discover which books are for you very important and why. And maybe we can also, because I know that we have here in our books the grief, the poems, a lot of the theater, we have a lot of things, so maybe we can just start and you can pick up your microphone and start to take a note. And yeah, I don't know, Nastia, yeah.
Hello, I'm Nastia, as I was introduced before, and as Stella said, and as it is said on the website of Hermann Hesse, he published his Library of World Literature in 1929, but a century later, in 2025, both the world and literature have both changed profoundly, and especially, as quoted from the website, the growing presence of works written by women and marginalized groups, and I have chosen 2 books that I thought were great representations of that quote. And so the first book that I chose is written by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she comes from Nigeria, and she grew up in a university town and studied both in America and in Nigeria. So she has that representation in both points of view of her experience in life, and she writes novels and personal essays. She first published a novel called Americana about an immigrant woman from Nigeria in America, and then she published this personal essay called Notes on Grief, which talks about how she lost her father during the pandemic of COVID in 2020. And I think this book is essential because, like, against a backdrop of the overwhelming number of people affected by COVID, and every single one of us being essentially affected by COVID, Adichie's poetic and fragmented style of writing offers a singular and also intimate storytelling and perspective of a raw and emotional loss of somebody as close as a father. And I think she's also a great representative because she's both marginalized in terms of gender and in terms of geography. And the second book that I chose is Daughter, or Dotsa in Ukrainian, which was originally written in Ukrainian by a woman named Tamara Duda. And she was a volunteer when the first Russian invasion happened in 2014. And she wrote this novel about the protagonist that experiences the Russian invasion from the first explosions that she hears outside her street, from the civilian perspective, all the way to seeing her street empty and hearing Russian language all around. And being from Ukraine, this really resonated with me, having gotten a phone call in 2022 saying that my parents are in a bomb shelter and they're hearing explosions outside. And I think it is a very great work because it conveys something as inexplicable as war for people for whom it may be foreign in peaceful Europe. And it establishes this kind of verisimilitude, which means conveying a story, even if it's fictional, in a really realistic and believable way. And I think it explains this experience of war, which is foreign to many people, in a very poetic and beautiful way. Yep. Thank you.
I think that for me, freedom at least is self-discovery and being able to find your own identity. And for me, literature is a great place, my way of doing that. I think that what you can get from books is, like, freedom of imagination is but I think really allows personal expression, and it may be just engaging in writing or reading. So the two books I brought were The Odyssey by Homer and Sei personaggi in cerca d'autore, or Six Characters in Search of an Author by Luigi Pirandello. I will discuss The Odyssey first, because for me it's a favorite, and every time I say The Odyssey is my favorite epic, or my favorite, one of the oldest books I read, everyone always says, what about Dante's Inferno, what about Dante's Divine Comedy? And I must say, I prefer this much more. And not to bash on Dante, of course, but for me, The Odyssey is just a story about self-discovery and understanding what it means to be you, and being able to go through Ulysses' journey with him and the way it is described, engaging with nature, metaphors, and even just self-reflection and understanding how your history makes up who you are is a very important for me, and it's one of my values, because coming from southern Italy, and my grandparents are all spread throughout, and being from, what was considered the Magna Grecia, this book really resonates with me because it makes me understand how my history, how my culture made up who I am today, even though I am far from my roots, kind of, even though it's just southern Italy. For me, it just resonates. The second book is Sei personaggi in cerca d'autore, and for me, this is almost an inversion of what is explored in The Odyssey, because you're just lost. As an audience member, as a character, you have no idea what's going on. And I think, personally, that's beautiful. Because, you're an audience member and you walk in, and these are two completely different time periods. And while The Odyssey explores what it means to be you, Six Characters explores what it means to not know who you are, and trying to figure out who you are based on a story that you don't know, you don't know your origins. And for me, even just engaging as an audience member or as a character, understanding how your surroundings even make up who you are or undermine who you are by not explaining it, just reveals how lack of freedom because of no delineation of surroundings undermines your own identity in a way, and how you're able to explore it. So for me, these two books, for me, this is just freedom of expression, because the two ways these approach the same concept of identity and character is just fascinating.
And who you are now, Alessia, after the read of these two books?
Sorry?
Who you are now, after these?
I read these books in the same year, in the first year of high school, and I think The Odyssey came first. I read this first, and reading The Odyssey, I just kind of understood how my journey made up who I was, and how my family's journey made up who I was. One example I really like making is how I'm very grateful for being able to be here in the school, because my grandparents, for example, they emigrated from southern Italy, and when they didn't get to go to university, my grandma barely finished Scuola dell'Obbligo, and my grandparents were street sellers, and they were up to a few years ago. And right now, seeing my dad, my grandparents were almost against him going to university because they weren't sure if that was the right way for him, because of their history and because of their cultural, background. Because, being from southern Italy and being from Calabria, which is a very, rural part of Italy, and it still is, going to university and just going to a more industrialized part and exploring new worlds was scary for them. And having the ambition to go and push your limits, which is what Ulysses does in this, and brought my dad to being able to go to university and provide me and my brother with the life that we have. And Six Characters taught me to question that. And I think, these two books taught me how to embrace my identity while also questioning it in itself, and being able to push myself beyond the boundaries of what is delineated to really, really understand who I am.
Thinking about my favorite books, the first book that will come to mind is probably the book series A Song of Ice and Fire by the American writer George R. Martin. It is a fantasy book that I have always liked and enjoyed fantasy books ever since a young age. But I think what is really important and what is really special about this book is what it taught me, what it taught me. And I read that book for the first time during the COVID-19 period. I was in quarantine, and there were lots of people getting sick and dying during that period. I was quite lost, I could say, and I could only find consolation in literature. That book taught me how to reconcile myself with death. And yes, this book also explores other aspects of life, such as the morality of characters and the good versus evil. But what the topic that really moves me is the topic of death. I also lost my grandpa that year, and who I was not particularly close, but it was a strange experience to come so close to death. And I have to wonder what is the meaning of it and what should I do when it is near. It was during the COVID-19, and sometimes I often wonder whether I would just get sick or maybe die on the next day. But that book, it showed me how the vicissitude of life is, but it still does not mean that we should lose hope or be desperate, but we should enjoy life itself and try to find a meaning out of it. And the second book that I really enjoy, that is something that is even far more important, I think, in a way, is a red dream, a dream in a red chamber. It is by Cao Xueqin, written during the Qing dynasty. It is unfinished since the original author burned the last 28 chapters of it, when he felt that it was not perfect enough. It is a book about the fall of an aristocratic family during the Qing dynasty in China, written from the perspective of the male protagonist and the many female characters. This book is very, very, I think, important and extraordinary for its great emphasis on women characters. It's something that is really rare in the history of literature, I believe, and it certainly is the book that emphasizes most about the role of women in the Chinese literature. It is known for its beautiful flowery language and has also great philosophical views regarding the same topic that I have said in A Song of Ice and Fire, death. Pretty much by the end of the book, most characters have either died, exiled, or suffered in something else. It is also a book about the vicissitude of life, how fortune comes and goes in a random way. So this book in the end is about how to give up this obsession or desire for anything actually. It has really strong Buddhist idea of letting things go, letting everything go, not only wealth, not only love, but maybe even yourself, and by that you live with harmony with nature, and by that you can withhold against all the sufferings and the pains of the world.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to say I really did not know before this event what Alessia, Nastia, and Diana were going to say. So it's fascinating for me to hear what they would say. What I did know is that they would tell stories about themselves in relation to the stories they were presenting. And I was thinking about 2 years ago when we read the Odyssey with Alessia and her fellow students. And one of the things we talked about with the Odyssey that I think is the most powerful moment is when Odysseus washes up ashore on the land of the Phaeacians. He famously goes to the king of the Phaeacians, and he's still a stranger at this point. He's received well because it's a culture of hospitality, and they ask the fundamental question to him, who are you? The question you are asking. And the answer to Odysseus' question is probably about 150 pages of the Odyssey. He tells the story. So the story that we know, all of the famous incidents of the Odyssey, are actually told by Odysseus about his adventures. And so I think one of the things that he says right before he begins his story is he talks about that famous Greek notion of pathos mathos, of we learn through suffering. And I think some of those ideas about trying to understand that it's not our experiences that define who we are, it's our telling the stories about these experiences that define who we are. And I think it's interesting to me that if you think about, in all three of your answers, you talked about, you know, the influence of the feeling of parents and grandparents and the kind of genealogical pressures that form your identity. And you talk about the experiences that come from these layers of war and political conflict and the way that that inflects who you are. And then you're talking about a time when you were forced by, you know, an unforeseen and horrific pandemic to reflect upon the meaning of death at an extremely young age. But it's interesting that the question that I want to turn this into is, if literature is maybe one of the most powerful ways to define who we are across the power of story, how do these books help you? These are not your stories, these are other people's stories. So the question for me is, when you think about your own lives and who you are, how do these particular stories help you think and answer that question?
Okay, so, you know, answering the question, who are you, as Dr. Love posed, and how these books help me make out who I am, being able to answer that question has always been hard for me. Not because I don't know who I am, because it's hard to formulate. And I think the 150 pages that Dr. Love mentioned of the Odyssey, in which Ulysses explains who he is by telling his stories, is, you know, it made me understand, you know, what the answer to that question was. And it isn't adjectives, it isn't, you know, a quick conversation, it's the telling of stories over time, slowly, with patience, just as he did, telling his story, because it took us time to understand and analyze and really go through how every single word and every single instance and every single chapter of his life was significant to how he shaped his character, or how his environment shaped him. So I think the Odyssey helped me understand that from that aspect, and understanding that my life is made up of stories and anecdotes, and it's not made up of, you know, quick instances of your life. 6 characters. It's hard to say that this helps you understand who you are, or because the characters in themselves don't know who they are, which is why I love this book, by the way. Luigi Pirandello is like absolutely one of my favorite authors. Him and Kafka just fascinate me. And at the end of the day, their philosophies are pretty similar, you know, how it's just this idea of unheimlich and uncertainty. And in a world right now, in a modern world, even at least this text, it's like 100 years old, if not more, if I'm not wrong, right? They're still important today, because at least I don't know if everyone knows what 6 characters in Search of an Author is about. I'm assuming you know about the Odyssey, but 6 characters in Search of an Author, it was a very, very controversial play, because Pirandello wrote it in which the audience comes in and it's an unprepared stage. And it's a continuous interaction between the director, the characters, and the audience. And the first time, at least my Italian teacher told me that, you know, the audience left halfway through the show and they started booing, and it was just very, very badly received. And essentially it's 6 characters trying to understand who wrote their story. For me, this book, or this play rather, helped me understand who I am, or helped me, you know, express myself under that aspect by understanding how not only it's the anecdotes that make up who I am, but it's my interaction with the other people, and it's the uncertainty that is present in my life, which actually reinforces the boundaries of my identity. Because, as I said before, you know, it really pushes my thinking. It makes me consider everything. It almost makes me like a complete skeptic about everything that surrounds me. And I think that because of that, it really makes me question my values, or rather how I decide to view what surrounds me. And that helps me formulate who I think I am as a person, and even my daily conduct.
thinking in terms of who I am, a word that often comes up in my life is sonder, which is when in a crowd of people you look around and realize that every single person and every single human being has a life that is just as complicated as yours, and is not just a background character in your own story. And I think that both these books really speak on that notion of something, of like a universal event, like a pandemic that affects millions of people, like a war that affects the whole country and even people outside, but that every single story inside of those big universal events is an own personal story. And how in the millions of people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, there's Chimamanda who lost her father, probably just like millions of other people around the world, but she tells her own story in a way that is so intimate and personal. And in the same way, the protagonist in Daughter by Tamara Duda also speaks about her friends that surround her, the friends that she loses throughout the war, how she becomes a volunteer throughout the war, the animals that she loses, and she really focuses on the signified and the signifier, which we talk about often in our English class, and she really gives meaning to every single object, and she speaks about the surroundings more than she speaks about herself, and I think that really resonates with the word sonder that I talked about previously.
There's something that I do when I try to find myself, to define what I am. I try to interact with other people, and from that differences I feel between I and other people, I try to define myself. That is what happened between those books that I really liked. They have lots of characters, at least hundreds of characters in each book. They have different personalities, and they have their nuanced stands in their views and other aspects of life. And reading those characters, reading from those different perspectives on life, I can find who I am, and I can realize what my view truly is, depends on whether I agree or disagree with those characters. And also, both those books really focus on the idea of suffering. Even as far, for example, in this book, Dream in a Red Chamber, it has a strong Buddhist idea that living itself is a kind of suffering. In the Buddhist idea, living, aging, being sick, and also loving, hating, everything is a sort of suffering. So therefore, in the end, I really enjoy reading those pessimistic views on life, because sometimes I find myself that I disagree with those views, and that is what I think who I am. I'm actually more optimistic than I have imagined. And also those books about suffering really helps me when I actually think that I am suffering, or sometimes I just really have a small hard time. I try to follow what these books tell me, how to calm myself down, how to ignore, and how to find a pattern beneath everything in life. And those books really help me to stand against all those tribulations, say, in life.
I also want to add something about like defining who I am through these books. Tamara's Daughter, in a way, casualizes war, in a meaning that she speaks about war as something that's not from movies that you see on the screens. It's something that can happen to anyone and that can affect any person across the world at any time, at any unexpected time. And in a sense, there's even a quote where she says that it wasn't like fiery buildings from the movie that I saw the other day. It was the empty streets, it was the dead people laying around that just really captured her. And this really resonates with me because a lot of people in Ukraine, including myself when I visit and including all my relatives, when you're living through a war, you do not know whether you're going to be alive the next day. And it is something that becomes so casual, and you get used to it. You get used to those sirens every day. You get used to reading on the news how many people were injured, how many people were killed in a bombing last night. And even though every time your heart breaks reading those stories, it becomes something that occurs every day. And for yourself, looking at that universal experience across the country, you don't know if you're gonna be there the next day. And I think everybody in my country and that is still living there can resonate with that feeling.
Yeah, I also forgot to mention that why I chose this book, Dream in a Red Chamber, is because it kind of offers a cultural connection between China and me. So, when I first read it, I was in 6th grade and I was still in China, so therefore this book, it was an amazing book. I could feel that, but I did not have the desire to read it 6 times or 7 times. And it felt like a normal book. I did not feel there's anything that is truly unique about it. But only when I became older, when I came here, when I became an immigrant, I picked up this book again, written in Chinese, and I found it to be drastically different from anything that I read in the school. Not only from the language or the style, but also in the ideas, in the details. Because this book, it truly reflects a Chinese society and the traditional values that I find that I can only find now in literature, because I'm not living in that. Reading this book really makes me realize that who I am, and that I cannot actually cut away my connection with my culture, not at least in the foreseeable future.
It's very interesting because while I'm listening to you, I can discover the relationship between your books, because in Sei personaggi in cerca d'autore we have these 6 characters. They are searching this author, and this research is the research of Ulysses in the Odyssey. And when Polyphemus says and asks to Ulysses, "But who are you?" he says, "My name is nobody." So it's not a real answer, or it's the answer which reflect how Ulysses was, no? Because he was polytropos. He was with a lot of ideas, very intelligent, and his answer is, "I am nobody." And in 6 characters in Search of an Author, we have these 6 characters who don't know who is the father, we can say, no? So it's very interesting because they are, these are really a relationship between, and in Daughter and Notes on Grief, we have, I can say, maybe this idea of loss, because when you, Nastia, were talking about the war, I had this idea of these pandemics, and in the pandemics we had this war language, we can say, because we had every day this bulletin with how many deaths we had, how many contagi. So it's very interesting to to reflect on these books, and also maybe on your stories, because I think that these characters, these books, these authors maybe speaks to you also because your histories, no? So I don't know. Also, if you I don't know. If you have to write now a book or your story, or you want to describe your status, I don't know, in this moment, have you maybe a part of the books you choose?
This is a hard question. Surprisingly, I don't think I would reach for either of these books to do that. I actually think I would reach for one of Kafka's short stories, which we're reading right now in our English class, which is why you see Dr. Love being very surprised. You know, two stories come to mind, and it's The Worry of the Family's Father, or is that the title? It's close enough. Okay. And Before the Law, I think. The Worry of the Family's, the Family's Father. For me, I would reach for that because, you know, it just talks about this little tiny creature who just follows you around and you never know when it's going to pop up. And when it does, you know, it kind of talks to you and it kind of doesn't, and it just goes away. I think if I were to write my story, or if I were to identify with a story, which I think I'm doing right now, it would be that one. And because I think about the future a lot, and I always think of it with such certainty. And discussing now, I understand that, you know, there is no certainty in the future, and it's kind of like this looming little creature that comes around, kind of talks to you, then goes away and then comes back. And when it does, you're surprised and you're scared and you're curious. You don't know how to interact with it, but it's there and it's present, and you know it is, but you don't know how to reach it and you don't know how to find it. And you know, this glooming sense of curiosity, really, and, you know, waiting and urgency and anticipation of seeing what's gonna come and how it's gonna come. For me, at least, is how I would, you know, tell my story. It's just, you know, sustained curiosity and sustained urgency and sustained questioning, because the story is just the family's father being like, when is this creature gonna come? Why is it here? And I think I can resonate with that story a lot.
So I think I would definitely reach for these books if I were writing my own story, because as Dr. Love said, it is not the experiences that shape us, but it is how we tell our experiences that shape us. And I found a really interesting quote from Notes on Grief, where Aditya says, "Grief is forcing new skins on me, scraping scales from my eyes." So whenever you experience something like loss or a pandemic, you have this notion of just changing everything. And I think Aditya puts it very nicely through those bodily metaphors. And she puts something that you can't explain into words. And she does it in a very beautiful way, I think. And also throughout the whole novel, she uses the continuous tense, where she talks about grief as something not stagnant and not something that just happens and stays there forever, but something progressive, something liminal, and where you often go in between those states. And with all the experiences in my life, I also find myself often in that like liminal space between two states that I think Aditya describes perfectly with her language. And yes, I would definitely reach out for these books if I were writing my own story.
I'm not very sure. I think I might find some elements that are really useful in those books for my personal story. Perhaps the vast number of characters, also the complex morality of those characters. But I cannot really think of a single passage that can really describe my current situation. My life is not that painful, but it's maybe I agree with what Alessia said. I think really Kafka really describes better our current life. I might perhaps choose the trial for that. The story where the main character is being judged and punished for no reason at all, and he is always trying to find a way to go through. I think that describes my life pretty well. Sometimes I have strange assignments, whether from school or from home, or just strange things that I have to do for strange reasons, but I do them anyway, and they prove to be a great cost of time and my energy, but I do them anyway. But in the end, the fact might not be satisfying at all.
Since Kafka looms so large, I thought I wanted to ask a question about something you've mentioned already, which is the notion of the uncanny. And I think one thing in reading literature or in talking to you about literature and talking to friends about literature, one thing that I think often comes up is this feeling of being at home and being estranged at the same time. That we encounter that which makes us feel comfortable, makes us feel as if we're moving into our own realm, but at the same time we feel alienated and dispossessed in a way. And so one thing I wanted to talk about is, and this is a bit of a shift in the conversation, is about language. And we have 3 books on this table that are not in English. So we have Italian, Chinese, and Ukrainian. But I wanted to ask, when you're reading among different languages, and I know all 3 of you do read among more than 2 languages, what do you feel about language gives you a sense of being home, even if it's a different language? And what do you feel estranges you? And what role does translation play in that?
I have very strong opinions about this. So, for me, language... Sir, you're my English teacher. Don't take this personally. I think that Italian... No, I'm just kidding. Italian has more nuance. So, when I read in Italian, I think I question it more directly. And it might be because of, it's my first language, so that might be why it's easier for me. But when I read Italian or Italian works, or usually, Italian work, especially Pirandello, or, poetry or anything, I just sit there, sit there, consider it for a little bit, and it makes me think. And in English, maybe because I've always approached it with a more academic look, I really need to analyze it to question what's happening, except for Kafka. That was interesting. But, so I think that for me, language, it's both an obstacle and it facilitates my understanding. For example, when I read books in Italian or when I read books in English and I don't understand what's happening, I might, go online and search for an Italian or an English version to try and understand better and under more aspects what the general meaning of it. Because when they say lost in translation, they're really serious about that. Because if I try to read books in many different languages, somehow for me it's easier to grasp the general understanding, because every single translator puts an effort in trying to maintain the original meaning in the text and poses it in many different ways, which for me facilitates that. And for me, language has always been a difficult thing to grasp as an idea, because it's had a massive impact on my life. And talking with you, it made me, like with all of you, it made me understand that, because I moved here when I was very, very tiny. I was 3 years old. And I was put in a British preschool before coming here. And ironically, I learned to read and write before I learned to read it in English, before I did in Italian. Just because of the age and the environment which I was put into. My teachers, I'm not joking, came up to me, I was 3, and started speaking to me in English. I had no idea what was going on. My mom tells me the story that the first day she dropped me off, she heard me 10 meters outside with this school had very thick walls. She heard, "Mamma, io voglio la mia mamma, venitemi a prendere, non mi capisco." So, you know, I've always had this language barrier in myself, and every time I go to Italy or anytime I go anywhere, I'm too international or too American or too English to be Italian, and at the same time I'm too American international. I'm too Italian to be American or international, and so for me, language in itself has posed a conflict in who I am as a person, because it has forced me to think through who I am, going through the internationality of my character and of my upbringing, which is something I'm very lucky to do, first of all, but it's also something that makes me really understand the value and the power of language and how everything happens around me.
So, in terms of this, I strongly agree with Alessia, because even though I've been reading in English mostly for the past few years of my life, when I read in English, I find myself overanalyzing stuff before I can actually understand what it is, especially in such complex stories as Kafka. But when I read in Ukrainian, I find that it's like a flow of language, and a single word can mean so much because of both historical and cultural context. So a little backstory, Ukrainian language in general throughout the centuries has been through many challenges, and it had a lot of attempts at erasure. So starting from the 17th century, when the Russian Tsar ordered to burn the Gospels printed in Ukrainian, also banning all the books written in Ukrainian, and giving punishments for seeing any book written in Ukrainian, and also something known as the executed Renaissance, which occurred in the 20th century when during the Soviet era there was a lot of prominent new and young Ukrainian writers, artists, and activists that were either imprisoned or executed by the Soviet Union just because of the fact that they spoke Ukrainian, spanning all the way to today, when more often than you think, I get asked the question, is Ukrainian even a language? Does Ukraine have its own language, or is it just Russian that you speak? I found myself often thinking about the meaning of language and how important it is, because language can be such a tool in life. It can be something used to make something beautiful, but it can also be used as a means of oppression. And for example, I also speak Russian, but I only speak it for the reason because centuries before, my ancestors were forced to speak Russian, and they would literally be killed if they didn't. And I think this historical and both cultural connotation of language is a really important topic to me nowadays.
For me, it is also true that when I'm reading in English, it feels more academic and feels clear. I feel I am dissecting something or observing something, and all the words speak to me to great clarity, and I receive them with great clarity. But when I'm reading in Chinese, it's probably because I read in Chinese more for leisure, not for academic reasons. And I can feel the text more. I emphasize more with the emotions the writer tries to convey. It's probably because it's my mother tongue, and I have been learning and speaking it in school until 6th grade. That was I think that was quite late for me. By that time, my English was nowhere as good as my English now. But also speaking about the loss of language in translation, I think I have so much to say about that because Chinese is just such a different language from English and from other Indo-European language. It doesn't really have an alphabet except pinyin, but that is for pronouncing only. It has all those 2-bit characters. It forms words differently than how it works in English or other Indo-European languages. It is pretty much just smashing the characters together, and by doing so, you can have a more nuanced, more obviously nuanced word, because you are actually combining two visible concepts. And there are also lots of things that Chinese language is different from other languages. But I think the most important element there in this book, in the Dreaming in a Red Chamber, is the pause. Because in Chinese language, lots of words have the same pronunciation. They have the same exact pronunciation, but they're all written differently. So that is actually another layer of nuance in literature, where the writer can actually convey their ideas through those puns. For example, the protagonist here in this story is called Jia Baoyu. If you actually translate those words based on their etymology, it actually means aristocratic, precious jade. Yes, but the word aristocratic, it is also the same sound as the word fake in Chinese. And you can't really translate that in English. But it's very important here because later in the plot line, Jia Baoyu would meet someone who's called Zhen Baoyu. Zhen is also similar to the sound. No, it's the exact same pronunciation with the word real in Chinese. So there's one character who is fake and another character who is real. So this really discusses the connection between reality and the dream, the reality and fantasy. Further, it is connected to the Buddhist idea that the life is only but a dream. It is quite a pessimistic view. And
I think also often when I read, I often think about what is not said instead of what is said, called like the inexpressibility tapas, if you put it into academic language. And this makes me think back to an assignment we did last year in class, which was to translate a poem from our native language into English and also explain our choice of translation. And I chose a poem by probably one of the most famous poets in Ukraine, which is Taras Shevchenko. And he was also imprisoned by the Russian Empire for having written in Ukrainian. And while he was imprisoned, he wrote one of his most famous poems called "Oh My Thoughts, Oh My Thoughts." And this whole poem makes me think of the notion of what is not said, because he does not talk about imprisonment, he does not talk about freedom. He is talking to his thoughts while he's lacking freedom, instead of explicitly stating what is said. And in the same way, I think this book, Daughter, talks about that. And even on the back of the book, on the little description, it says, and I'll try my best at translating, it says, this book is about love, but it doesn't have any word that starts with L-O. Basically, it doesn't mention the word explicitly. And I find it very interesting how authors can express so much by not even stating the explicit notion.
Building off of that, for me, like building off of both of your thoughts, Diana, when you said before about, reading more for leisure, for me, I can't say that's for me, because I've always been, analyzing works in both languages. So I can't say that it's because I read more than one book, more than one language than the other for leisure. But I can say that a difference, which was surprising for me, and the first impact was how differently you analyze books in Italian than you do in English. For me, that was mind-blowing. I was completely surprised because in English, you really analyze the language. And even the lexical structure, the grammatical structure really evokes a meaning out of the passage, which the first time, like when I first learned that technique, surprised me. And with Italian, at least from my experience, while you do assess, literary devices and grammar, you get a lot from the plot, you get a lot from the story, and you get a lot from the author. And while in English, I'm often told, don't say the author meant this because you don't know. In Italian, it's not encouraged, but it's definitely a more present thing. And so because of that, I think I'm more pushed to read Italian works with more of an understanding for the characters in itself and for the language and for the plot in itself to really resonate with it. And then what Anna said before about the poet, in Italian there's a lot of poets from Ermetismo, and when I did the same project, I did Salvatore Quasimodo, and I had the honor of translating one of his poems. He's Sicilian and so am I, and actually he's from the same town as my Italian teacher, was quite interesting. But thinking about the inexpressibility of language and saying things without saying the direct word, for me it made me think of that specific type of poetry, because so much is said in such mysterious language that it's thought-provoking, and it's a unique response that the reader has to the language, which I think is one of the most important parts of literature. It's not necessarily authorial intention, it's not necessarily what the characters do in the story, but it's how that resonates with you and how that evokes emotion in you.
It's beautiful to see in how many ways we can translate the translation. So I had a lot of ideas while you were talking about it, because I also thought about the compromise you have to do for be free, because you, Anastasia, said that you had to learn Russian because of your ancestors, and this was very interesting because I often think about this topic, because I learned, I grew up being well with French because of my father is from Congo, but French was the language of the colonizer and not the language of Congo. But I never learned Lingala, that is the language of my father. So yes, I can recognize it, I can spoke a lot of tiny phrases and so, but this is very interesting because for being free you have to have the compromise also for the language or for other things, but it was very interesting, this topic. Thank you. And Alessia was I know that you talk about the topic, you have this southern Italian family, and I wanted also to know from you if the language is not only the analysis or other things or the school, but also a way to express the love. And with the dialects, maybe with your grandparents, or I don't know if you have this shelf for the dialects in your family. And Diana, I have also a question for you.
Okay. So I'm very lucky because my grandparents are from 3 different regions in the southernmost part of Italy. So my dad's father is from Calabria, my dad's mother is from Puglia, and my grandparents from my mother's side are from Sicily. And we were discussing before Calabrese dialect, at least where I'm from, which is from a little city in the province of Catanzaro, and Sicilian dialect are surprisingly very, very similar, which I was very curious about. And the little difference between me and my brother is that my brother knows Calabrese dialect. I don't, but I understand it, and my brother does not understand and does not speak Sicilian dialect. Well, I understand it. I don't speak it, unfortunately. But being able to interact with my grandparents, like for example, when I was very, very tiny, I remember my grandparents, when they could still travel, came to my house here in Lugano, and my grandma pulled me aside, my same grandma pulled me aside, and you know, when she was in Milan, because now she moved back down to southern Italy, she used to be, you know, a esthetician for, you know, footballers' wives, because they had a very nice salon. And so she was, you know, almost forced to abandon that side of her, because, you know, southern Italians coming out to southern Italy also had a lot of discrimination. So she had to almost abandon it. And then one day she called me aside, she goes, okay, you go to mom, and you tell her this filastrocca, and it tells a story of Titina that wanted fish for lunch, but her mommy didn't have it, so she made her like pasta al pomodoro, and it's Titina voru pisci, la mamma non capisci, Titina voru broru, ca pasta pomodoro. And you know, I went to my mom and I sang her this song, and my mom was just so shocked. And even though in itself the filastrocca isn't saying anything, it talks about Titina who wants fish for lunch, right? But even that little act, it's my grandma telling, you know, sharing her knowledge and her love, not even knowledge, just her love for me and her daughter through these little actions. And my grandma, even though it's not dialect, though it is, there's two anecdotes. In Puglia, my grandma's from provincia di Canosa, di Puglia, no, yes, Canosa di Puglia. We eat snails with tomato, and it's not escargot. It's almost like sausage with tomato. It's just as delicious. And you know, my aunt and my grandma, they would come to me, it's like, you know, today you're gonna try shamaruquid. What is that? Like, what? Snails. Lumache. Nonna, ma lumache si dice lumache, it's not shamaruquid. No, shamaruquid, now you learn. And so, I haven't had that delicacy in forever because it takes a long time to clean, but you know, even that, it's how my cultural knowledge of food was, you know, shared with me through dialect. And you know, even though it's not dialect, my grandma wasn't very educated, and during COVID in Italy to go around, you had the green pass. And my grandma would go, I couldn't go in the grocery market because of my wind pass. Nonna, what? Wind pass. No, Nonna, green pass. Wind pass, what did I say? So, you know, even though it's not necessarily language, even little mistakes, for me, it's just really the interaction you have with your family and how language plays such an important role in that. And I think, at least for me, because of the importance of dialects and how varied they are within regions, because, for example, if I, from Catanzaro, go call for someone from Cosenza, there's no way we're understanding each other. It's more likely that a fight is going to break out. But, you know, it's beautiful. And also seeing how, you know, maybe in Milan right now, because my parents grew up in Milan, there's not a lot of that dynamics, but there's morphing of it. So, for example, when people from southern Italy moved up, you know, you would say monets for the trash bag, and people wouldn't understand you, or you would be made fun of. So now in Cologno Monzese, which is where I grew up when I was very, very tiny, because there were a lot of people from Calabria that moved there, and they didn't want to be made fun of. Now to say trash can in Cologno Monzese, you say monnezza, which, you know, it's so beautiful for me to see and curious to see how even dialect is able to move in the world.
Thinking about dialects, the first thing that crossed my mind is my Chinese dialect is actually called Dongbei-hua. It actually means northeastern dialect. I think it's one of the dialect that is most similar to the Mandarin because it's in the north, the geographical position is the same, and also initially Mandarin is kind of based on the Dongbei-hua, on the northeastern accent, because it once was the richest, the most industrialized part of China when China was first established. But also my parents, they come from different parts of China in a way. So it's a long history. But by the time of my grandparents, the northeastern part of China is also called Manchuria. There weren't lots of people there. So lots of people became immigrants and they moved there. my maternal grandma is from Zhejiang, that is from the south of China, and my maternal grandpa is from Shandong, and so are my paternal grandparents. So they all moved away from their homes to this northeastern part of China, and they form a new accent there. But then what happened to my parents is they moved away from their city and they moved to the city that I was born. It's called Dalian, which is in the southeast part of that northeastern part of China. So in the end, my accent became quite a mix. It's not really distinguished. The Dongbei, the northeastern accent, is famous for its humor, but not the accent that my city had. And also, speaking about dialect in literature, one thing about the Chinese is the change in sound, the change in pronunciation does not reflect in the text, because those characters are not written based on the pronunciation. They're just characters that are fixed. So people from different parts of China can have drastically different dialects and accents, but the words, the written characters, the written text would always be the same.
I want to say this, if the ghost of Hermann Hesse were present here, I would imagine, in considering his work, the Universal Library, he would be thrilled to hear what you have said. He might not be thrilled to know that we do have to finish now and end this conversation, which could, I think, and would be lovely if it could go on all night. But I do want to say this, I really want to express my gratitude to you, Alessia, to you, Nastia, and to you, Diana, for doing this, because it is, I should say to anyone here, it's not easy in the midst of a full academic schedule and a full IB schedule, no less, to take this time to do this. But your thoughtfulness and your responses to these questions were utterly fascinating, and we could spin off from anything you've said and do an entirely different event like this, though that might be exhausting for everybody involved. In addition to thanking you very, very much for this, I want to thank you, Stella, for hosting and being here for this. I want to thank the Hermann Hesse Museum and Marcel for inviting us and for making this happen, because I know this is, there's a lot of work and thought that goes into this. So I also would like to thank Mr. Marc Chevalier, our Director of Communications, for all his help in making this, communicating this outside to the world. And thank you all. And I want to say maybe one last round of applause for our event.